Okay, hi everyone. So welcome to week 4 in this series of talks about ways of driving change in ways that build a larger us rather than a them and us, and bridge political divides rather than deepening them. You'll remember that we are in the process of looking at these 4 key capacities: diffusing, belonging, bridging, and navigating, all of which in different ways are central to this work of larger us change making. And today we're going to be talking about bridging, which is all about how we bridge divides between us and our perceived opponents. And I want to start today by talking about a psychological idea called in-group bias. Now, you'll remember that last week in the talks on belonging, we looked at the fact that as humans, we're hardwired to see ourselves as part of groups, and that's where belonging comes from. But something else that comes from it is this phenomenon of in-group bias. And this is the kind of cognitive bias that we all have that means that when we see ourselves as belonging to a group, we naturally tend to regard other people in that group more favorably and often to give them preferential treatment. Now, that isn't always problematic, but there's 2 areas in politics where it can be very problematic. One, of course, is all of the ways that this can underpin and drive inequality, where it can create kind of biases that we may not even be aware of, but that can have huge impacts in shaping, for example, other people's life chances. If we consistently, at job interviews, for example, pick the candidate who seems most like us. And another way that this can drive big political impacts is, of course, all of the ways that in-group bias can create animosity and tribalism between different groups, the kind of affective polarization that we were looking at in week 1, where polarization is less about disagreement on the issues and more about just sheer dislike or mistrust of the other side. Now, another big idea in all of this that's really important to understanding the divides that we have to bridge is a sociological trend called the big sort. And it's something that's taken place in recent decades, both on and offline. So let's start with the offline aspects of the big sort. This is basically the way that in the last few decades, we've become more likely than ever to live near and befriend and work with and study with and even date and marry people with backgrounds and experiences and outlooks very, very similar to our own. We live in these kind of increasingly homogenous little bubbles. And of course, online, that's happening apace as well, because one thing that social media is very, very good at is helping us to connect with other people who share, again, the same values, the same worldview as we do. And so you get the familiar problem of online echo chambers, where we're kind of surrounded by the like-minded, and we can come to think that ours is the only valid or sensible way of looking at the world. And the flip side of that, of course, is that when we do encounter people who are very different from us, it can come as quite a shock. It's something that's less familiar than it used to be in years past, where we would much more routinely have met a kind of cross-section of our compatriots on a regular basis. That's less true today. And that means, as I say, that when we encounter the other, it can be a shock. So think of, for example, the morning after the Brexit referendum. If you were a Remainer, like I was, then this would have been, in many ways, an astonishing result, something you didn't see coming because you just didn't know many Leavers. And you were surrounded by other people who felt exactly the same about Brexit as you did. And so encountering the reality that a lot of people saw the world very differently was a shock. And this can give rise to the phenomenon that psychologists call othering. And this is an intergroup phenomenon where you see yourself as part of a group and you regard people in other groups as essentially different from and generally inferior to your own group. So it's a kind of very deep, interesting form of prejudice that can erupt as a result of in-group bias and this phenomenon of the big sort. Now, what about the ways that we as change makers can be part of the problem? Well, one of them, of course, is every time we other our opponents. And again, Brexit is full of examples. I mean, I saw so much of it on both sides, of Remainers showing contempt towards Leavers and the same coming back in the other direction. But there's many, many other political issues where that's the case. Think of all of the kind of so-called culture war type issues, where again, they're rife with othering across that political divide. And as we touched on in the first week of these talks, that kind of deepening divide can create risks to democracy and can make some people tip towards a preference for authoritarian forms of government. And it can also create that phenomenon we looked at called mutual radicalization, whereas one side others their perceived opponents start to feel threatened or feel like they're the object of contempt or disrespect. They then start othering the first side, and back and forth it goes with that net increase in political toxicity. But a really important point to understand here is that we can make people feel othered even when that's not our intention and maybe not even something that we're consciously aware of. Last week, I mentioned the example of Extinction Rebellion and this protest in 2019 in Leeds, which I was part of, and realizing while I was there that we were this very homogenous group, but a lot of people felt a bit othered by us because we looked different and because we were coming across as occupying the moral high ground, leading some other people to feel kind of disrespected or not included or not welcome. It's an example of accidental othering. We weren't trying to make those people feel othered, and yet that was in some cases very much the net effect. And this is even more true in cases where we call people out for disagreeing with us. Here's another slide that we looked at last week of someone imposing a kind of a purity test at a climate change demonstration and saying to people that they should shut up about climate change if they eat meat. It's another way that people can feel othered. And then as a result, we're deepening political divides rather than bridging them. So those are just some ideas, the idea of in-group bias, the big sort, how othering can erupt through our change-making work, sometimes when we're not even aware of it. All things that can make our work harder as change makers. And in the next talk, we'll be looking at what we can do about that.